He built the place to be a sanctuary, but when he walked in, the air reeked of fear. Arnold stepped through the side entrance of the oak forge, his boots silent on the matte tile he'd personally chosen 5 years ago. A faint chime rang as the door shut behind him, unnoticed. Nobody turned. Nobody greeted him. It was Friday night, and the dining room pulsed with practiced motion servers weaving like threads through a tapestry of candlelight and clinking glasses. Everything looked perfect, too perfect. He moved slowly, not from age, but from caution. He was heavier now, broader than he used to be, but the weight wasn't just muscle. Something in the air felt off. Maybe it was how the host didn't recognize him and pointed to the bar with that corporate smile. Maybe it was how the busboy at table 6 was folding napkins too fast, like he couldn't slow his hands or he'd fall apart. Arnold nodded politely, said nothing, and kept walking. His coat, a dark wool thing too warm for the season, brushed against the backs of chairs as he passed. Nobody noticed. That was the point. He didn't want attention. Not tonight. He scanned the room like a man counting exits. The oak forge had once been a machine shop. He'd kept the steel beams exposed, left patches of the original floor untreated. Don't polish out the past, he'd told the contractor. Make it part of the story. Back then, every decision had been personal, every knife, every soul on staff. But stories fade if you stop reading them. He only came back like this every few months, no PR, no security, no announcement, just to walk the halls quietly, as if the building itself might speak. Sometimes it did. Tonight, it whispered something he didn't want to hear. He passed the kitchen hallway and stopped. There it was, a sound, faint, not a crash, not a yell, something worse, crying, not loud, not performative, just raw. The kind you hide in the back of your throat. The kind that leaks out when you've run out of ways to hold yourself together. A sound no one else seemed to hear, or maybe they did, and chose not to. Arnold froze, his jaw tensed, breath held. Then, slowly, he reached into his coat pocket and touched the cold metal badge tucked inside an old thing, worn and bent, with one name etched shallow across the front. Anna, his sister, the one who used to cry like that, when no one listened. He didn't speak, didn't frown, he just exhaled, low and sharp, and turned toward the sound, not as the owner, not as the legend on the wall, but as someone who had once been too late. This time, he wasn't walking away. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The hallway leading to the back rooms was narrower than he remembered. Arnold moved quietly, his frame brushing the photo-lined walls, black and white snapshots of former chefs, birthday parties, handshakes with local farmers. He had hung them himself once, framed them on a Sunday with an old level in a trembling hand, long before arthritis had claimed his knuckles. He didn't look at them now. The sound was clearer here, still soft, still desperate, but unmistakable. A choked inhale, then silence, then another. The kind of silence that didn't calm, it warned. He paused outside the break room. The door was half open. Fluorescent light poured through the gap, sharp and cold, clashing with the amber warmth of the dining room just down the hall. It made the space look sterile, unfeeling, like a place meant for crying, not healing. He stepped closer, quietly. Inside, a young woman stood with her back to him, leaning forward over the stainless steel counter like she was bracing for a blow only she could feel coming. Her apron was bunched in her fist. The name tag clipped to her chest read Emily. She didn't see him. She was still, too still. Mascara clung in trails down one cheek. Her eyes were shut, jaw clenched like breathing might shatter her. There was something in the way her shoulders curved, a fatigue that went beyond muscle. It lived in the spine, in the bones. Beside her, another server stood, shifting weight from foot to foot. He looked younger, nervous. His eyes darted to the clock above the microwave, then to the floor. Tyler, his badge read, he was whispering something. Emily shook her head. I can't, she muttered. Her voice cracked on the second word. You don't understand. If I say anything, I'm done, Tyler whispered. His voice carried guilt, or maybe fear, probably both. Then he glanced toward the door. Arnold instinctively stepped back, out of view but not out of presence. His shadow still flickered on the far wall. He didn't need to see their faces. He'd heard enough, and he'd heard it before. Not their voices, but that rhythm, that pattern, one person drowning in silence, another afraid to speak, both convinced it was their fault. He pressed his fingers into the old metal badge in his pocket. The edge bit into his palm. The name Anna felt hot through the cold. She had once worked in a place like this. Not here, not this restaurant, but one just like it. Smiles on the surface, rot underneath. A tray clattered somewhere out in the kitchen. Both servers flinched. Emily wiped her face with the back of her hand, scrubbed hard at the streaks on her cheek, and straightened herself with a mechanical breath. She moved toward the time clock. Tyler followed, hesitant. Neither spoke again. Arnold remained still until their footsteps faded. Then he looked into the break room, at the counter where her hands had clutched the metal edge. He'd built this room to be a refuge. Tonight, it felt like a trap, and someone had turned the key. Back in the dining room, the music hadn't changed. It was still that slow jazz mellow, harmless, like it had been curated to say, everything here is fine. But Arnold knew better. He moved along the edge of the room now, weaving past wine shelves and polished wood without making a sound. From this angle, he could see everything, and more importantly, everyone. There by the host stand, a tall man in a navy blue dress shirt stood with his arms crossed, posture perfect, haircut razor sharp. He didn't fidget. He didn't blink too often, just watched. At first glance, he looked helpful, controlled, even charming, a manager. But Arnold had seen too many masks to fall for the easy ones. The name tag clipped to his shirt read, Rick Calloway, General Manager. The name hit like an old bruise. Rick turned slightly, flashing a customer service smile to a couple waiting near the door. It was too smooth, too trained. A performance. Arnold stepped closer to the bar, keeping his gaze loose but steady. From here, he could observe without being observed. Calloway didn't notice him, or maybe he did and didn't care. It wouldn't be the first time. Arnold hadn't seen him in nearly 20 years, not since a leadership seminar in San Diego. Back then, Rick had been a rising assistant at another restaurant chain. Polished, smart, ruthless in a way that didn't show up on paper. There had been a complaint once won that never made it to HR. Arnold remembered it because he hadn't followed up. He remembered the girl's name, though. He remembered the letter. He didn't remember doing anything about it. Now here he was again, same man, different title. A predator who wore professionalism like cologne. Too much. Overpowering. Arnold ran his fingers slowly across the bar top. The wood was warm from the lights, smooth from use. He felt the grain with his fingertips like he was reading Braille. Good evening, sir, the bartender said suddenly. Arnold turned. A young man, clean-shaven, alert, stood ready, towel slung across his shoulder. Water, Arnold said, voice low. Of course. The bartender moved efficiently, retrieving a glass with practiced grace. Arnold didn't drink tonight, not when he needed his head clear. He took the glass but didn't sip. His eyes returned to Rick. The man was watching the servers now, watching Emily, to be exact. She had re-emerged, back on the floor. Her apron straightened, her eyes distant. Rick shifted slightly, adjusting his stance. Emily saw him. Arnold saw her see him. It was subtle, the tightening of her jaw, the hesitation between steps. She wasn't afraid of work. She was afraid of being watched. And Rick didn't look like he was supervising. He looked like he was hunting. Arnold set the water down gently. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't just management. It was manipulation. And it had a face. The sound of plates clinking didn't stop. Even as Arnold left the bar and began walking again, slower this time, more deliberate, the din of conversation, the laughter, the hum of evening rhythm kept flowing like background music in a scene no one dared disrupt. But beneath that rhythm, something else pulsed, something he could feel. He stopped at the server station near table 9, a thin strip of counter where silverware was stacked, bread plates warmed, and glances exchanged. Tyler stood there, head down, hands busy arranging forks that didn't need rearranging. Arnold approached like any regular might, casual, one hand still in his coat pocket, thumb pressing against the old metal badge like it could keep him steady. "Hey," he said softly. "Got a pen?" Tyler looked up too fast. His eyes widened for just a moment before the mask kicked in. Yeah, sure." He fumbled for a pen and handed it over. Arnold took it, but didn't walk away. "You're Tyler." "Right." Tyler nodded, slowly. "Yes, sir." Arnold glanced toward the dining room, then back at him. "Your friend." His tone was gentle. "She seemed upset earlier." For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then Tyler's gaze flicked, just briefly, toward the host stand, toward Rick Calloway. Then it dropped again. "She's fine," he said. Too quick, too flat. His hands started folding napkins that were already folded. Arnold didn't press. He didn't have to. Some truths don't need permission to be heard. He set the pen down gently on the station, gave a nod, and turned to go. But as he stepped away, he caught something. Not words or not motion, just a breath that Tyler held too long, the kind you hold when you're not sure what happens next. Arnold returned to the bar, sat again. The water was still untouched. From there, he watched. Not just Rick, not just Emily, everyone. The rhythm of the staff. Who avoided whom? Who stiffened when Rick stepped near? Who smiled too wide? Who never made eye contact? And something else. Emily had returned to table 12. She poured water, took orders, nodded politely, but her smile, it missed the eyes. Her movements were tight, rehearsed, like someone walking a balance beam with no net. Arnold watched her tuck her apron, wipe the side of a plate no one could see. Her hands were steady, but her voice when she spoke to the couple wavered just enough to be real. He glanced at Rick again. The man hadn't stopped watching her, and Arnold hadn't stopped listening to everything that wasn't said. The hallway looked even longer this time. Arnold walked it slowly, not because he needed to, but because he couldn't rush what was coming. Some doors didn't open with force. They waited for you to be quiet enough to hear what was behind them. The ticking clock above the break room pulsed like a metronome. The fluorescent hum, the smell of citrus cleaner, the metallic cold of the stainless steel counters, it was all the same. But something was different now. Emily was back, alone this time. She stood at the far end of the break room, not leaning this time, but locked in place, hands flat against the countertop, like she needed the surface to remind her she was still here. Arnold didn't walk in. Not yet. He stayed just outside the frame of the door, his shadow cast low across the tile floor. He didn't want to surprise her. She was muttering something, barely above a whisper. "If I speak," her voice caught. "If I speak, I..." She didn't finish the sentence. Arnold's chest tightened, not in fear, but memory. That exact cadence, that exact pause. His sister had once said the same thing. If I say it out loud, it becomes real. That was the last thing she wrote before they found her. Inside the break room, Emily opened her locker with trembling hands. Not frantic, just practiced, like someone who had memorized how to hide. She pulled out something small, a piece of folded paper, crumpled at the corners, creased from being opened too many times and never sent. Arnold stepped back before she could turn. He didn't want her to see him yet, because this wasn't about catching her in the act. It was about recognizing it. Back in the hallway, he leaned against the wall. Just for a second, the badge in his pocket felt heavier now. It wasn't just a relic. It was a question. What do you do when the system you built begins to crack the people inside it? He looked down the hall toward the dining room. Music still played. Glasses clinked. Somewhere, someone was laughing. The world hadn't noticed. That's the cruelty of it. The worst moments don't come with warning alarms. They happen in quiet rooms with ticking clocks and locked jaws. Arnold moved away from the wall. He passed the kitchen, eyes scanning. He saw Tyler again, balancing a tray, eyes darting, jaw clenched. He saw Nate at the bar, drying the same glass 3 times. He saw Rick, still watching, always watching. Arnold's jaw set. He took one last glance toward the break room door still ajar, still glowing with that cold, sterile light, and made a silent promise. The next conversation wouldn't happen in whispers. The manager's office wasn't big. A desk, 2 chairs, a locked file cabinet, schedules taped to the wall, laminated rules about food safety and conduct. Everything looked exactly as it should. That was the problem. Arnold didn't knock. He opened the door like he belonged there because once, he had years ago, before they hired a management team, this was his desk. The same oak chair, the same paint, slightly chipped behind the doorframe. It felt like a memory standing upright. Rick Calloway was mid-email. He looked up, startled only for a beat. Then came the smile. "Sir, Mr. Schwarzenegger, I didn't realize you were visiting tonight. If I'd known, Arnold closed the door behind him. Quietly, Rick stood, smoothed his shirt. "I hope everything's satisfactory." "Sit," Arnold said. Just that. One word. Solid as stone. Rick sat. Arnold didn't. He paced once behind the chair opposite the desk, then stopped. One hand rested on the back of it, the other deep in his coat pocket, fingers brushing the badge. That familiar shape. Cold. Unforgiving. "There's a problem here," Arnold said. Rick's face flickered, then settled. "If this is about Emily, I assure you, she's a bit emotionally high-strung, but nothing I can't manage. It's been a stressful week." Arnold didn't blink. "She's afraid of you. She flinched when you walked past. That's not management. That's control." Rick adjusted his collar. "With respect, sir, I think you may have misread. She wrote a resignation letter," Arnold said. Rick's jaw tightened. "That's news to me." "She never turned it in." Arnold stepped forward. "Just once. And you know what that tells me? It wasn't a threat. It was a confession." Rick didn't answer. Arnold pulled his phone from his coat, tapped twice, played the audio. Emily's voice fragile, quiet. "If I speak, I'm done." Then Tyler. "He doesn't own you." The room was silent but for the faint hum of the overhead light. Rick leaned forward, face pale. "You recorded them." "No," Arnold said. "I listened. That's more than you did." He stepped around the chair now, moving closer to the desk. Not looming, just unshakable. Rick tried to find ground. "Look, I've made mistakes, but there was a girl once," Arnold said. His voice shifted lower, more distant. "She worked in a place like this." She said nothing. Everyone else said less. "She wrote me a letter once. I never answered it." He reached into his pocket and held out the badge silver, dulled, bent at the edge. The name Anna barely legible. "She was my sister." Rick swallowed, said nothing. Arnold stepped back. "You don't just create fear, Calloway. You build it, you polish it, and you call it protocol. Then, quieter, that ends tonight." Rick didn't speak for a long time. He stared at the desk like it might offer him a script, something clean, defensible, rehearsed. But there was nothing. Just the grain of the wood. A faint scratch near the corner from when Arnold had dropped a coffee mug here. Years ago. Back when the place still smelled of fresh stain and first chances. Arnold stood still. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even cold. He was beyond both. "You think fear is discipline," he said. Voice steady. You think silence means respect. Rick shifted. I, I didn't touch her. I never said you did. That hung in the air. What you do with power doesn't always leave fingerprints. Arnold moved toward the window. It faced the alley behind the restaurant gray bricks. A flickering light. The back gate. The same alley Anna once stood in, cigarette in hand, wondering if anyone would ever believe her. They hadn't. He turned. I should fire you right now. Rick straightened slightly, like that was something he could fight against. A familiar shape of conflict. But Arnold didn't move toward confrontation. He moved toward decision. I'm not giving you a punishment, Arnold said. I'm giving you a mirror. Rick blinked. What does that mean? It means, Arnold said, you have a choice. He walked back to the desk, placed his phone on the table, screen still lit, hovered his thumb over the corporate HR contact. One tap. That's all it would take. Option 1, he said. I press this. HR reviews everything. They'll pull every shift report, every staff comment, and your name, it won't show up in this industry again. Rick went pale. Option 2, Arnold continued. You walk out there. You stand in front of them, the staff, the ones you've bent, and you tell them exactly what you did. Rick's mouth opened. You want me to not apologize? Arnold cut in. Tell the truth. No spin. No excuses. Tell them you used fear to feel powerful. Tell them you made her feel small, that you knew what you were doing, and you did it anyway. Silence again. You can't fix what's broken, Arnold said, but you can admit you broke it. Rick's eyes dropped to the floor. I don't think I can do that. You can, Arnold said. You just don't want to. He folded the badge back into his pocket, slow and deliberate. Anna never got that choice, he said. She kept quiet, and I let her. So now when I see someone like you, I don't walk away. Rick sat like a man holding his breath underwater. You walk out there, Arnold said, nodding toward the door, or you disappear. One lets you live with the truth. The other makes sure you're erased by it. Rick looked up, a single nod, fragile. Arnold didn't smile. He stepped aside. Then go. The office door opened with a soft click. Not dramatic, not theatrical, just final. Rick Calloway stepped out first. His shoulders were straighter than expected, perhaps out of habit, perhaps defense, but his face told the real story. It wasn't fear. Not yet. It was the look of a man realizing the part he'd been playing was over and the audience was still watching. Arnold followed a few steps behind. He didn't walk beside Rick. He didn't need to. The dining room had quieted, as if it sensed something unspoken rising. Servers slowed their steps. Tyler stood frozen near the cutlery station, his arms crossed tight. Nate leaned on the bar, drying nothing. Emily stood near table 12, alone, shoulders rigid but upright. The restaurant didn't stop, but it paused. Rick cleared his throat. It came out dry. I need to say something, he began, voice not much louder than a whisper. To all of you. No one moved. No one interrupted. He glanced down, then back up again. I've failed this team, he said, not just in leadership, but in who I've become while holding it. A glass clinked in the distance. No one looked away. I created an environment, Rick continued, where fear replaced feedback, where silence felt safer than honesty, especially for Emily. Emily didn't flinch. He looked at her directly, voice cracking now. I used my position to intimidate, not openly, but enough to be felt. I knew it was wrong. I did it anyway. Tyler shifted slightly. Nate's hands stopped moving. I'm stepping down, Rick said, effective immediately. And that was it. No tears, no grand gestures, just truth laid bare in the open. Heavy, inelegant, real. He turned and walked toward the front door. His steps, once measured and rehearsed, now dragged faintly. No one followed. No one stopped him. The door closed behind him with the same chime Arnold had heard when he entered hours ago. Only now, it sounded different. Not an entrance. An exit. Still, no one spoke. Arnold stepped forward not to command attention, but to acknowledge the moment. He didn't stand center room. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked at each of them, one by one. Tyler, Nate, and finally, Emily. "You've been carrying a weight," he said. "That weight is gone now." Emily met his eyes. Not fully, but more than before. She reached into her apron, pulled out a folded piece of paper. Worn, familiar. She held it out. Arnold took it, unfolded it slowly. A resignation letter, dated 3 months ago. "I wrote it," she whispered, "but I never turned it in." Arnold nodded. Then, without a word, he folded it again once, twice, and tore it clean down the middle. He stepped to the host stand, picked up Rick's metal nameplate, cold, unfeeling. Then from his coat, he pulled the old badge. Anna. He laid it gently over the nameplate. No speech, no explanation, just a quiet burial. No one moved right away. The room, still dim with closing hour light, held a kind of stunned quiet, not the awkward kind, but the kind that follows a storm. Tables were half cleared, bread baskets abandoned, glasses left with fingerprints that no one had bothered to polish out yet. For once, the weight in the room wasn't fear, it was aftermath. Arnold stood near the host stand, his hands still resting on the folded badge that covered Rick Calloway's nameplate. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The silence wasn't empty. It was full. Full of everything that hadn't been said for months, maybe years. Tyler spoke first. "I know you got rid of him," he said, voice low but steady, "and I'm grateful." Arnold looked up, just listened. "But," Tyler continued, glancing around, "this didn't start with Calloway, and it won't end with him." Nate nodded quietly behind the bar. "It's how we're trained. Keep your head down. Don't make waves. You speak up, you're out. Simple." A server near the kitchen added, "We weren't just afraid of him. We were afraid of what happens when people notice us." Arnold let their words settle. He wasn't surprised, just heavy. Emily was still near the middle of the room. She hadn't sat, hadn't stepped forward, but something in her posture had shifted. Less braced, less coiled. She raised her eyes. "I thought this place was different when I started," she said softly. "I needed it to be." Arnold nodded slowly. "When something felt off," she continued, "I didn't think I had the right to speak. I thought maybe that's just how the world works." She looked at him. "Isn't it?" Arnold took a breath. He walked slowly to the center of the room, not to take the spotlight, but to stand on even ground. "Not anymore," he said. "It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. This place wasn't built to be like the world." Arnold continued. "It was built to be better, to prove you could lead without fear. I failed that. Not because I meant to, but because I wasn't here." He paused. "I was looking at reports, reviews, profit margins, the kind of numbers that look clean. But the truth," his voice dropped slightly, "the truth lives in break rooms, in the way someone flinches when their name is called, in how a resignation letter sits folded for 3 months." Emily looked down at her hands. Arnold glanced around the room. "I won't let that happen again," he said. "But I can't fix it alone." Silence again, but this time, it felt like possibility, not paralysis. Tyler stepped forward. "So, what do we do?" Arnold answered without hesitation. "You speak," he said. "You tell me what's wrong before it rots. You speak for the next person who's too scared to." He looked toward the kitchen, "And I promise you, I'll listen." It was nearly midnight. The last guests had long gone, leaving behind half-melted candles and chairs pushed carelessly beneath tables. The music had stopped. Someone had turned it off without realizing. All that remained was the soft clink of silverware being sorted in the back and the low hum of the refrigeration unit near the wine cellar. Emily stepped out first. Her apron was gone, coat tucked under her arm. She didn't rush. Her steps were small, deliberate, like someone who had just remembered how to walk without apologizing for taking up space. Tyler followed close behind, still chatting with Nate, their words hushed and half-laughed. They didn't look like employees leaving a shift. They looked like people who had survived something together, something no one else in the city would ever know had happened. Arnold didn't follow them out. He stood alone near the host stand, one hand resting gently on the old badge he'd left atop Rick's nameplate. It was a quiet monument, no plaque, no inscription, just Anna, barely legible, catching what little light remained in the room. Across the street, his truck waited under a flickering lamppost. He didn't go to it yet. He was still listening. Eventually, he walked out the side door, into the crisp night air. The kitchen vents still whispered the scent of rosemary and charred oak. The street was empty, except for the occasional car humming by in the distance. He made it to the truck, slid into the seat, didn't start the engine. From the passenger seat, he picked up the badge again, ran a thumb across the edge, where the steel had bent slightly over time. She would have liked Emily, he thought, would have told her to leave sooner. But she would have understood why she didn't. He placed the badge gently on the dashboard. Then he leaned back, exhaling through his nose. A knock on the window startled him. He looked over. Emily, bundled in a faded gray hoodie, cheeks flushed from the cold, her hands tucked into her sleeves. He rolled the window down halfway. "Didn't mean to scare you," she said with a small smile. "You didn't," Arnold replied. She hesitated, looked down, then back up. "I just wanted to say, thank you," Arnold nodded. "You did the hard part. I almost didn't, but you did." She glanced at the dashboard. Her eyes caught the badge. "That hers?" she asked softly. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. She reached into her coat pocket, pulled out something small, a tarnished metal charm, shaped like a feather. "I used to keep it in my apron," she said. "For luck. Thought maybe. You should have it." She handed it through the window. Arnold took it carefully, held it for a moment, then, slowly, he placed it beside the badge. 2 names, 2 weights, one remembered, one beginning. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't have to. Sometimes, the smallest things are what save people, and sometimes a feather weighs more than the world. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.